remember now we're talking about, we're from chapter 18. You remember Jesus came and they came to get him. Judas came with this band of people with the lanterns and torches and weapons. And they asked, who do you seek? And he said, Jesus of Nazareth. And he said, I am he. And he went backwards. The men went backwards and fell to the ground. And then he told them again. And then he says, let these go. His disciples go. So they take him and they arrest him. Of course, in this instant also, Peter pulls out the sword and smotes off Malchus's right ear. But the book of Luke tells us that Jesus healed it. And so the band took him, they bound him, they took him away to Annas. And Annas then began to question him. And of course, Peter and John were following afar off. And Jesus was in the halls of Annas. And of course, this is when the damsels started to question Peter. And then later on, a couple others questioned him, and he denied all three. And of course, Jesus told him before the rooster crows that he would be guilty of denying him 3 times. And so, in the court of Annas, the high priest asked Jesus of his doctrine. And yes. No, I think it's Annas here. Now it was Caiaphas, yeah, at the end when Peter. I'm still with Annas. He's still in the court of Annas because Annas asked him these questions. What about your doctrine? And he says, well, I spake openly in the synagogue, in the temple, and I have nothing to hide, nothing have I done secretly. And that's when they slapped him on the face. And so Jesus said then, if I've spoken evil, you bear witness of the evil, but if well, why do you smite me? Now notice, now Annas had seen him bound unto Caiaphas, the high priest. So this is when he went to Caiaphas. And he was at Caiaphas when Peter had denied him the last 2 times. And then he went into the Romans hall of judgment. And that's where the Jews would not go because, hey, we don't want to defile ourselves before the feast. And so then Pilate came out, and Pilate then began to talk to him. And Pilate then told the Jews, you take him and judge him yourself. And they said, well, we have a law. Our law says that we can't put anybody to death. Yes.
To your point, John 18, verse 24, then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas. So what you were talking about was originally, that's when Annas, he interviewed first, and then sent to
Caiaphas.
Caiaphas.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Okay.
So is Annas also called the high priest then? Because
He-
verse 19.
They said he was high priest that year. Annas was one who had, according to what scholars say, he had like 5 or 6 sons. And he was high priest at one time, and then each time he would give his son this job. And finally, Caiaphas was his son-in-law. And he gave Caiaphas the job of high priest. And so they took him to Annas because he was like maybe the old person of the high priest. You know, he was, they wanted him to question him first. And so they sent him then. Now, John's the only one that records this about Annas. The rest of them only record about Caiaphas. And so they sent him then to Caiaphas. And then Pilate then came out at the hall of judgment and asked, what do you bring against this man? And they said, well, if he wasn't a malefactor or a thief, we wouldn't have brought him to you. But, and the Jews said, by our law, he should die, and we can't put him to death. And so Pilate then began to question Jesus a little bit. He says about him, say thou that this of thyself, or did others tell it to thee? And Pilate said, I'm a Jew. And then Jesus explained to him that his kingdom was not of this world. His kingdom was a spiritual kingdom. He was not a threat to the Roman kingdoms. Now, the Romans were very, very strict in making sure they kept everything down. You remember in Acts chapter 19 when Paul went to Ephesus and he had talked against the goddess Diana. He said, God is not a God that can be made by hands. And of course, Demetrius and the others were all upset about this. And for 2 hours, they were crying, great is the goddess Diana. And the town clerk got up and said, hey, look, we need to put a stop to this, because if the Romans get wind of this, we're going to be in trouble. They didn't have the authority like people have today. If they don't like the Roman rule, well, we just go out and take some signs and walk around and tell down with the Romans or something like this. That didn't happen then. The Romans would have put them to death real quick for insurrection if they'd done that. They didn't have those freedoms that people have now to demonstrate or do anything like that. And so the Romans kept a pretty tight lid on this thing. They didn't let it get out of hand. Now, Pilate is, like we talked about before, and from the other Gospels, he was trying his best to he knew Jesus wasn't guilty. His wife had told him, have nothing to do with this just man. And he was scared. He actually, the Bible says he was scared. All he wanted to do was chastise Jesus and let him go, because he knew that they were doing this just for the purpose of satisfying their own selves. And they really didn't care about the Jews. The Romans didn't. They cared less about the Jews. You see, the Romans kept control even of the temple. In the temple, there was a tower there in the temple that the Roman soldiers stayed at. It was on guard all the time. And so they were watching the Jews all the time to make sure nothing. Now they let them have their religion and everything like that. They didn't try to stop them, but they were still in control. And so that's why Pilate told Jesus, don't you know that I have the power to let you go, or have the power to crucify you? And Jesus says, you couldn't have any power at all except the Father gave it to you from heaven. And so, Pilate then, he tries his best. And then finally in chapter 19, and we're going to get to where we were last week in just a minute, they took Jesus, and they scourged him and brought him out. The soldiers put on a purple robe and a crown of thorns, and they smote him with their hands. And Pilate brought him out to the Jews and says, behold your man, behold the man. And he thought perhaps that would be enough. But notice the chief priests and the officers with him, when they saw it, they cried out again, crucify him, crucify him. We have a law that he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. Now, you remember how they had convicted Jesus at his trial. Well, when you go to trial, how many witnesses did you have to have? At least 2. Where'd they get their witnesses? They's false witnesses. They paid them. And all they would say, well, we've heard him say that you tear this temple down and we'll build it back in 3 days. That was the charge. And so they paid these false witnesses to come and to testify against Jesus. And so Pilate, though, notice when he heard this, he became more afraid, and he still wanted to let him go. But the Jews says, if you let him go, you're not a friend of Caesar. We have no king but Caesar. And of course, he knew that Jesus' kingdom wasn't. Jesus told him, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, then my servants would fight. But it's not a physical kingdom. It was a spiritual kingdom, and Pilate understood that. And he knew he wasn't no threat. But yet and still, because of the pressure, Pilate then let him go to be crucified. And they took Jesus away and crucified him. And so, again, some things that John didn't write about this that we talked about last week. He was buried. He bared his own cross. But what does the other Gospels say who helped him with the cross? Simon of Cyrene. Jesus evidently was weak from what the beating and other things they took. Simon of Cyrene helped him with the cross. And and John doesn't tell us, there's a lot of things that John doesn't tell us that the other Gospels tell us. He doesn't tell us that how much money Judas received for selling out to the Lord. He doesn't tell us. The other Gospels tell us it's 30 pieces of silver that he did. And so there's some things, and John also doesn't tell us that when Jesus was on the cross, there was a great thing that happened. What was that? All three of the other Gospels tell us, but John doesn't. Yeah, but there was something else. Darkness. Remember? Darkness for 3 hours. Can you imagine how this was? Now, I don't know how dark it got. I do know that when you study the Bible from the plagues in Egypt, when it talked about darkness, the people could not move around. It was so dark that they could not, they just had to sit still because they couldn't see at all. Now, I don't know if it got that dark when Jesus was crucified or not, but it said there was darkness on the earth from the 6th hour to the 9th hour. 3 hours of darkness. What would you think? You know, I thought about this. What would you think if you was one of those Jews saying, crucify him, crucify him? And it got dark for 3 hours. I mean, and so, you know, it doesn't say a lot about the crucifixion, how, you know, other than the fact that he just took him and crucified him. And so, and he was crucified then with these thieves, one on one side and one on the other. And so Pilate then wrote this title and put it on the cross, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Now, he wrote it in 3 languages, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And he did that because it was a feast day and there would be people from all nations and all there that would be able to read that accusation they made against Jesus. And of course the Jews came to Pilate and says, will you change that and say that he says that he is the King of Israel and a King of the Jews. And Pilate says, what I've written, I have written. He would not change it. And so then we see then the soldiers had this job, and they took the garments of Jesus, and evidently, like Mark was saying last week, this is a necessary inference. The fact that there were 4 pieces of garments, one to each one, indicates that there were 4 soldiers that crucified him. And so, but they had the one piece of the garment that was a full piece, and they said it wouldn't be any good if we cut it up. And so they gambled or cast lots for his vesture. And so now we're getting to where we were last week. Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, and we think that was probably Salome or Zebedee's wife, Mary, the mother of Cleophas, and Mary Magdalene. Now, the wife of Cleophas. I'm sorry, I said the mother didn't. I'm sorry. The wife of Cleophas. And so these were the ones that was at the cross. Actually, there were 3 Marys there, but Jesus' mother is not named, and so that's the reason I told you that she wasn't one of the Marys that I was talking about. Okay, so when Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple standing by whom he loved, he said unto his mother, Woman, behold thy son. Then said he to the disciple, Behold thy mother. And from that hour that disciple took her into his own house. Now Jesus on the cross said 7 sayings. Can anybody know them? In the book of John here, he says 3 of them. Right, that's from the book of John. All right, from the book of Matthew, he only had said 1 saying in Mark. Anybody remember what it was?
How to forgive them?
No, that's Luke. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? That was from the book of Matthew and Mark. The book of Luke, he says 3 things. Anybody remember what they are? What did he say to the thief on the cross?
Today you shall be with me in paradise.
Okay. And what was the one you just said, Mark? Father?
Forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Okay. And his last prayer was, anybody remember? No. Yes. Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. So 7 things, 7 sayings he said on the cross. That's recorded. I'm sure he said other things because, and again, he may have not said a whole lot, but I think it's interesting that as you look at all the Gospels, you get a sort of a different view of what is said. Jesus then told this John to evidently to take care of it, and we think it's the Apostle John that he told this. And so he told him then to take care of his mother, and she went to his house from that day on. And so after this, in verse 28, Jesus, knowing all things was now accomplished, that the scriptures might be fulfilled, said, I thirst. And there was set a vessel full of vinegar, and they filled a sponge with vinegar and put it upon a hyssop and put it to his mouth. Now this hyssop is probably there was growed over there, and they said it was at least 18 or 20 inches long. It was like a stick, and they put the sponge on that and reached it up to his mouth. And so when Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, It is finished. He bowed his head and gave up the ghost. Now, Jesus died supposedly around the 3rd hour, somewhere along 3 o'clock. Mark said that he was put on the cross close to the 3rd hour of the day, and then there was darkness from the 6th hour to the 9th hour, and then after the 9th hour, evidently, Jesus died. He gave up the ghost, said it's finished. He bowed his head and died. And so others say that, the Jews then, therefore, because it was the preparation that the body should not remain upon the cross on the 7th day, for the 7th day was a high day, besought Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they may be taken down. Now what they do is, again, the Romans were a master at inflicting pain. This crucifixion was probably the worst thing that today we have, you remember used to have, I know when I was growing up and younger, they had the electric chair that they used to execute. But, that's too harsh. So now they've gone to this lethal injection. And some have even have declined it. And some states have come to the point that they have no capital punishment law. And again, it's because of this lax law. Brother, I think that's why so many of our laws are broken. You know, these people in times of the Romans, if they got caught doing something, they knew what the penalty was. A matter of fact, the thieves on the cross, now just for stealing, it was a death penalty. And it's like the Old West, you know, if you stole somebody's horse, they hung horse thieves. And so, just for stealing, the thieves on the cross said one to another, you know, this man has done nothing worthy of death, but we're getting what we deserve. You know, they knew that. And so their laws were very strict, and they didn't have these appeals and things like that. And they said they was put to death. The Romans went ahead and did this. And so Jesus then died this death, and they were, because it was close to the Sabbath day, and of course the next day would be the big day of the feast, they decided, they went to Pilate and asked, can we come and break the legs of these that are on the cross so they'll die so we can take them down? Because many times on the cross they would last quite a few days just on the cross, dying like that. And so these had just been crucified that day, and so they came to Pilate, and so he sent soldiers, and they break the legs of the two thieves. And then, but when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was dead already. They break not his legs. And so they break the legs of the thieves, but Jesus, because he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Now, they don't realize it, but they begin to fulfill prophecies here concerning the Son of God. You know, but one of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and forthwith came out there blood and water. And he saw and bare record, and his record is true. He knoweth that he saith true, that you might believe. And this is talking about John testifying the fact that what he has seen was true. He was there and seen this. But notice, for these things were done, that the scriptures might be fulfilled. Like I say, they didn't realize they were actually fulfilling what God had said. A bone in him shall not be broken. And again, another scripture says, they looked on him whom they pierced. I think it's interesting, and this might be a good question to remember, how many prophecies were fulfilled does the Bible say was fulfilled in John chapter 19? There were actually 3. It was the one with the soldiers gambling for his garments, the one for the ones that came to break his leg, not a bone in him will be broken, and then they'll look upon him whom they pierced. So after this then, Joseph of Arimathea, he was being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly. And most people think that Joseph and Nicodemus were part of this 70 people that made up the Sanhedrin. And they tried, you know, when you're in a minority like that, you don't have much saying, and you sort of keep quiet. Now, Nicodemus, you remember from chapter 7? You remember what Nicodemus said when they were... Yeah. Do we condemn a man before our law tries him? And so he, you know, but he secretly was a follower of Jesus. Now, John doesn't tell us one thing about Joseph that the other Gospels tell. Anybody recall what maybe that could be? He was rich. And that's another prophecy from the other books that says that Jesus was buried with the rich. And so John doesn't tell us that Joseph was rich, but Joseph went to Pilate, and he sought that he could take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him leave. And he came therefore and took the body of Jesus. Now, also, here's Nicodemus, notice, which came to Jesus first by night. Every time that Nicodemus is named in 3 chapters, and every time it talks about him coming to Jesus by night. He's named in chapter 3, chapter 7, and here in chapter 19. And so Nicodemus was with Joseph, and most people think that Joseph and Nicodemus were members of the Sanhedrin. But like I say, they didn't have much say. And so the majority rules, and that shows you too that the majority is not always right, because the majority ruled to put Jesus to death. And so, Nicodemus came, who came at Jesus first at night. He brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100-pound weight. And now, usually the women would be there working with this, but because it was late on the and the seventh was going to begin at I think the seventh began at 6 o'clock in the evening on Friday and run to 6 o'clock on Saturday evening. And so because of this, they took the body of Jesus and wound it in linen clothes with the spices, as the manner of the Jews is to bury. Now is the place where he was crucified. Now in the place where he's crucified, there was a garden. And in a garden, a new sepulchre, wherein was never a man yet laid. And like the other Gospels tell us that this sepulchre was owned by Joseph of Arimathea, and he was a rich man. And they laid Jesus, therefore, because of the Jews' preparation day, for the sepulchre was nigh at hand. And so we see then in the other Gospels, and also Mary came early to the tomb in chapter 19, Mary Magdalene. The women were coming to complete preserve the body of Jesus with these spices and other things. And that's why they were there so early on Sunday morning or the first day of the week. And of course, when they came then, he had done the greatest thing that ever happened, but he had rose from the dead. Now you think about this. If Jesus had not died and arose from the dead, we would be hopeless. That's the reason why we have hope of the resurrection, is because God raised him from the dead. And Jesus says God will raise you too. You remember chapter 5, verse 28 and 29? Marvel not at this, the hour cometh when all in the grave will hear my voice. Those that have done good unto the resurrection of life, those that have done evil to the resurrection of damnation. And so Jesus then...
We're not going to ring the bell, just hang in there.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
Actually, Christianity does not exist without the resurrection, because Christ would just be a man that came to earth, said a lot of good things, and died.
Yes.
So without that, there's no Christianity.
Yes. And the fact that when Jesus, and I wanted next week maybe to talk about some of these people that Jesus appeared to besides what John tells us. Now, John tells us that he appeared to the disciples that evening on the first day of the week, and Thomas wasn't there. And then 8 days later, he appeared to them again, and Thomas was there. And then when you get in chapter 21, he appeared to 7 disciples who were out fishing. And so this is appearances that John gives. But the other disciples give appearances where he appeared to the 2 men on the road to Emmaus, and that was the first day of the week. He appeared to the women, and then he had told his disciples, go into Galilee, and there I will come and meet you. He appeared to them from the book of Mark. We read that. And matter of fact, the book of 1 Corinthians tells us that he appeared to 500 brethren at once. And so Jesus didn't, the Jews still say that, well, the disciples came in the middle of the night and stole his body, from the book of Matthew. But Jesus proved himself by his resurrection. And he was with his disciples in and out for these 40 days, teaching them from the book of Acts things concerning the kingdom of God. And so, yes.
Okay, I have a weird question. Always weird. So, wherein was never man yet laid in the sepulcher? Why does that matter? And did they actually lay other dead people in the same sepulcher? I can't say that word.
Two.
Yeah.
Well, it's saying that nobody had ever been laid in there. It's like today, you might have by a gravesite. Nobody's ever been laid in that grave where you're at now, where you're going to go.
Well, I wouldn't think that more than one person would be in a grave.
Well, some of these tombs were like for families. They were large. That's why that John, we'll read a little bit next week, that John ran to the tomb and outran Peter, and he looked in, and then it says Peter went into the tomb. And so evidently it was a cave-like thing that they put the body in there, but it was for like perhaps Joseph of Arimathea, for his whole family that would be eventually buried there.